I was standing in the kitchen, unpacking a set of Wedgwood bone china tea things, when a stranger's voice on the phone spoke words no wife should ever have to hear. I was going through my late wife's belongings and found a camera hidden in the old house. Mr. Henderson's voice was hoarse. "Mrs. Blackwood, it's your husband, and your mother-in-law. On your marriage bed. The things they did. You need to come alone. Don't tell him. My name is Eleanor Blackwood. 7 days ago, my husband William and I had just completed the transfer for that Tudor-style old house in Kent. 2 stories of timber and stone, with a walled garden overgrown with clematis. 60% of the down payment came from a sapphire brooch my mother had left me. She had been a member of the Royal Opera House chorus all her life, never a lead, yet she saved every penny for me. The moment I signed my name, I said to her in my heart, 'Mother, look, your daughter finally has a home of her own.' I was 38 that year. On the 3rd day after moving in, with cardboard boxes still piled high, Mr. Henderson's call came through. His wife had passed away 6 months earlier. They had lived in this house for over 40 years. He said that inside the brass cover of the garden porch light, there was a small camera his late wife had installed to watch hedgehogs, and she had forgotten all about it when they moved. Today, while sorting her effects, he opened the cloud storage and saw that footage. I gripped my phone and looked toward the living room. William was hanging a cross-stitch sampler that read "Home Sweet Home" above the fireplace, while my mother-in-law Margaret steadied the high-backed chair for him and straightened his crooked collar with a casual hand. They were murmuring and laughing together, that easy intimacy making it seem as though this house, bought with my dowry and inheritance, had always belonged only to the 2 of them. William caught my gaze and smiled up at me. "Darling, you look pale. Are you too tired?" "Just dusty from unpacking, a bit of a headache," I heard myself say. "I'll run to the corner for some masking tape. Get some air." Margaret glanced at me, her mouth tightening slightly, but she said nothing. I grabbed my car keys and handbag and walked out. Sitting in the driver's seat, the leaded glass window in the rearview mirror was bathed in honeyed sunset light, as beautiful as the marriage I had struggled to maintain for 10 years. I told myself over and over that it must be a misunderstanding. But the shame in Mr. Henderson's voice and his "don't tell him" pierced my heart like an ice pick. I knew that this trip would set my decade of marriage on an irreversible course of collapse. Mr. Henderson lived in a cottage on the outskirts of Canterbury, overgrown with ivy, barely 20 minutes from my new house. By the time I parked in front of his gate, the sky had darkened. November wind, damp and cold, blew in from the English Channel. I sat in the car, my fingers white on the steering wheel, unable to turn off the ignition. He was waiting for me. The living room light was on, curtains half drawn, a stooped figure sitting by the window. I took a deep breath and pushed open the car door. On the gravel driveway, my heels made unsteady sounds, each step like stepping on my own heart. The door opened at my second knock. Mr. Henderson looked 10 years older than when we'd met at the closing, sunken eyes, grizzled stubble, wearing a worn-out wool cardigan with frayed elbows. The moment his eyes met mine, they dropped, as if unable to bear some weight. "Mrs. Blackwood, please come in." He stepped aside. "I'm so sorry to make you come all this way. I didn't know who else to tell." His living room was crowded with old furniture. On the walls hung photographs of his late wife, a silver-haired, kind-faced woman, in every picture slightly tilting her head as if listening. On the mantelpiece sat her urn, a small brass casket, beside it a bundle of dried lavender. "Please sit." He gestured to the sofa, but he did not sit. He stood by the fireplace, his hand unconsciously stroking the edge of the urn. "My wife loved your house when she was alive. She said it had a soul. 40 years of living there, even the cracks in the walls were soaked with the flavor of days." I sat rigidly, fingers clutching the strap of my handbag. "Mr. Henderson, the footage?" He flinched at the word, as if burned. After a few seconds of silence, he walked to the TV cabinet, opened a drawer, and took out a black external hard drive. He placed it on the coffee table but did not immediately hand it to me. His hand pressed down on the drive, knuckles white, as if making some difficult decision. "Mrs. Blackwood, before you watch it, I need to tell you something." He looked up, his murky eyes holding an emotion I could not read, not pity, more like a shared pain. About your husband and his mother, maybe you've felt something was off. I lived in that house for 40 years. The walls aren't soundproof, old wood carries sound. There were things I never spoke of because I thought it wasn't my business. But now, what I saw on that footage makes me regret my silence. My heart felt squeezed and released, over and over. Outside, the wind rattled bare branches, shadows swaying on the curtains like silent warnings. 30 years ago, Mr. Henderson began slowly, not meeting my eyes. 30 years ago, your husband and his mother lived in that house. Your husband was about 7 or 8 then. His mother, your mother-in-law, Margaret, rented my upstairs floor that year. My first wife and I lived downstairs, they lived upstairs. I never met your husband's father. Margaret said she was a widow, that her husband had died of an infectious disease on a ship bound for Australia. I didn't question it, she was always proper, paid rent on time, kept the upstairs spotless. He paused, adding a log to the fire. The flames lit his lined face, now etched with a belated guilt. Even then, I noticed something off. He continued. The way Margaret treated that boy, it wasn't like a mother. She bathed him until he was 8. She wouldn't let him go out alone, wouldn't let him play with neighbor kids, wouldn't let him join any after-school activities. Every night, I could hear her crying in her room upstairs, and after crying, she'd go into his room, close the door, and stay for hours. I thought it was a widow's neurosis, a bereaved woman's excessive attachment to her son. I didn't think much of it. Who would think that way? My stomach churned, a cold nausea rose from my depths. I clenched my jaw, nails digging into my palms. One night, I got up to use the toilet and heard something upstairs. Not loud, but old floors carry sound. It was the kind of. He struggled for words, his Adam's apple bobbing. The kind of sound that shouldn't come from a mother and son. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, hesitating whether to knock. In the end, I didn't. I told myself it was their private business, none of my concern. The next day, I saw scratches on the boy's face, his eyes swollen. Margaret said he'd fallen down the stairs. I believed her. Mr. Henderson's voice broke. He picked up his late wife's photograph, his rough thumb rubbing the glass of the frame. My wife knew, he said quietly. Her last words were, "That boy in that house, did you ever help him?" I lied and said I had. She didn't die peacefully, I know. She always remembered that boy. She was kinder than me. I spoke, my voice sounding as if from another throat. Are you saying that boy was William? Mr. Henderson did not answer, but his silence was answer enough. I stood up, my legs so weak I could barely steady myself. The walls of the living room seemed to press in on me. Every piece of old furniture felt like a sealed secret, exuding a sweetish odor of decay. In the photographs, Mrs. Henderson's smile now seemed to me a gaze of pity. "The drive," I said, extending my hand. "Give it to me." He hesitated for a moment, then placed the drive in my hand. His fingers were cold, like something fresh from a grave. "The files are dated. The latest is from 3 days ago, the first night you moved in. And there are some from 10 years ago. My wife installed the camera. She'd been secretly watching that house ever since the tenants before you moved in. She never forgot that boy. She wanted to know what became of him." I gripped the drive, its metal casing biting into my palm. 3 days ago. The first night. That night William said he was going to tidy the basement. He came back drenched in sweat, and when I asked, he said moving boxes was exhausting. I believed him, poured him a whiskey. He stayed a long time in the bathroom, the water running, and I waited for him in bed until I fell asleep. "Is the camera still there?" I asked. "In your living room ceiling corner, behind the curtain rod," Mr. Henderson said. My wife hid it well. If I hadn't been clearing her things, I'd never have found the device still connected to the cloud. "I watched the videos, and then I called you. I can't stay silent anymore. I owe it to my wife, and I owe it to that boy, though he's no longer a boy." I walked toward the door. Every step was like treading on a blade. Mr. Henderson called after me, "Mrs. Blackwood, wait." I turned. He stood by the fireplace, firelight casting a long shadow behind him. "What are you going to do now?" Go home, I said. That camera is still there. If you see something you don't want to see. I've already seen more than I don't want to see. I cut him off, my voice steadier than I expected. I need to confirm it with my own eyes. Mr. Henderson nodded, his eyes held sympathy but also a hint of relief. He had carried this secret for 30 years, and now he had passed the weight to me. I didn't blame him. He was the only one willing to speak, even if 30 years too late. I drove home, the hard drive on the passenger seat like a silent time bomb. The rain finally began to fall, fine drops beating against the windshield. The wipers swung back and forth, their rhythmic sound only sharpening my thoughts. I remembered so many things. I remembered the first time I met Margaret, how she stood at the door sizing me up from head to toe, as if appraising a defective piece of merchandise. I remembered at our wedding, when she toasted, "William will always be my boy, and no one can take him from me." At the time I thought it was a joke, and I laughed along with the guests. I remembered every fight we had, no matter the cause, William would end with, "Mother is right." I remembered the way he called Mum in his sleep, not the tone of a grown man missing his mother, but something more primal, more unsettling. I parked in my own driveway and didn't get out right away. The living room lights were on, glowing warm yellow through the rain. From outside, the Tudor house looked charmingly perfect, leaded glass windows, ivy climbing the walls, 2 brass lamps beside the porch, everything I had dreamed of since girlhood. I had saved for 20 years, maintained a marriage for 10, to stand in this house. Now I sat in the car, the wipers still sweeping back and forth, clearing and blurring the view before me, like my heart. I wrapped the hard drive in a scarf and tucked it into my handbag. I took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and dashed through the rain. In the foyer, William was unpacking a cardboard box. He looked up, his forehead beaded with sweat, curly chestnut hair plastered to his temples. He smiled at me, the same smile as 12 years ago, and it stabbed me in the chest. "Did you get the paint?" he asked. I froze, remembering the excuse I'd made as I left. "No, the shop was out. Have to order it." "You still look pale, darling. Are you catching a cold?" He set down what he was holding and stepped forward to touch my forehead. I instinctively stepped back half a pace. His hand stopped in mid-air, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Then that confusion was replaced by an expression I knew all too well, a slight frown, the corners of his mouth turning down, like a wronged child. "Ruatang, what's wrong? You've been strange lately." When he said strange, there was a faint note of reproach, as if my emotional instability was an affront to his authority. For 12 years, it had always been like this. Whenever I showed any dissatisfaction or doubt, he would use this aggrieved posture to make me feel guilty. And every time, I would apologize, soften, tell myself he just cared too much. But tonight, I didn't. "I'm just tired," I heard myself say. "Where's Margaret?" "Mum's upstairs, helping us tidy the bedroom. She's amazing, she's already hung everything in the walk-in closet." When William spoke of his mother, his voice held a peculiar softness, like a spoiled boy boasting about his mother. "She's staying tonight. The guest room isn't ready yet, so I thought." "She can sleep in my study," I interrupted. "The sofa bed pulls out." William's expression froze for a moment. "Mum said she could share our bed in the master, it's big enough." "No." My voice was calm, surprising even myself. The air congealed for a few seconds. William looked at me with a strange expression, as if seeing me for the first time. Footsteps sounded from upstairs. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs. She was 63, well-preserved, her silvery hair perfectly coiled at the nape, wearing a dark green velvet housecoat. Her gaze at me was like a blunt knife slowly scraping across my skin. "Eleanor, did you get the paint?" she asked, in exactly the same tone as William, calm and certain, as if she already knew the answer. "No," I said shortly. "What a pity. I was hoping to help you paint the guest room tomorrow." She smiled slightly, coming down the stairs with a light step, not like a woman in her 60s. "You don't mind if I stay tonight, do you?" William said the bed in the master. "The study has a sofa bed," I said. Margaret's smile didn't change, but the corners of her eyes tightened minutely. She glanced at William, and in that look I caught a signal, one I might have seen 1,000 times over 12 years but had never recognized. William spoke at once. "Ruatang, Mum has a bad back, the sofa bed is too soft. Let her sleep in the master, I can sleep on the floor. You sleep in the study. She sleeps in the guest room," I said. The guest room mattress had arrived yesterday, just not made up. "I'll make the bed." I turned and went upstairs without looking at their faces. I entered the still unpainted guest room, pulled a sheet and pillow from a box, and mechanically made the bed. Every movement carried a deliberately controlled force, like defusing a bomb. My hands were trembling, but my mind was eerily clear. In the hallway, I heard Margaret's footsteps. She slowed as she passed the guest room door but did not enter. I heard the master bedroom door open and close. Then her and William's voices next door, low, fragmented. I caught only a few words. "Strange, since we moved in, do you think she found out?" And the last word, "calm." I stood in the center of the guest room, waiting for the footsteps to fade. Then I walked into the master bedroom. Our marriage bed was a mahogany four-poster, part of my dowry. Margaret was already lying down, her back to me, breathing evenly as if asleep. She was not on one side of the bed, she lay precisely in the center, occupying both William's and my place. The duvet was pulled tight, revealing only her immaculate silver hair. I stood at the foot of the bed for a moment, my eyes scanning the ceiling corner where the curtain rod was. It was well hidden, mostly covered by the heavy damask curtains. If I hadn't known it was there, I would never have spotted it. I withdrew from the master bedroom, closing the door softly. William was in the study, curled on the sofa bed, his phone screen lighting his face. When I pushed the door open, he hastily flipped the phone over, quick as a thief. I'd seen that gesture so many times before, each time I told myself not to be suspicious. But now, every past anomaly linked up in my mind into a line. "Mum asleep?" he asked, with an undertone of nervousness. "Asleep," I said. "You should get some rest too, darling. You're really off today." He used the word again. I stood at the doorway, looking at him. My husband's face, a 40-year-old man, well-kept, still boyishly handsome. Long lashes, soft eyes, a smile that made people let down their guard. I had been fooled by this face for 12 years. "Good night," I said. "Good night, Ruatang. I love you." I closed the door. I had heard those words countless times in 12 years, but now they sounded like a mocking echo. Whom did he love? Me, or a cover that allowed him to maintain that morbid bond with his mother? I did not go back to the master bedroom. I carried my bag downstairs, through the still chaotic living room, to the small room on the ground floor I used as a studio. The studio faced north. Through the window lay the garden, rain streaming down the glass, distorting the clematis vines into grotesque shapes. I closed the door, locked it, and connected the hard drive to my laptop. The fan whirred, the drive indicator blinked. There were 6 video files, named by date. The most recent was 20241103_2247, 3 days ago, the first night we moved into this house. My hand hovered over the touchpad, unable to press. The rain came through the window, and in the distance thunder rumbled, like a belated judgment. I knew that once I clicked, my life would split in two, before and after. And I was hanging on the edge of the crack, with infinite darkness below. I clicked on the video. The footage was black and white but clear. The camera angle was aimed at the living room fireplace and sofa. The timestamp in the lower right read 22:47. The living room lights were off, only the dying embers in the fireplace gave a faint glow. At first, nothing, just the empty living room, unpacked boxes piled in corners like an unfinished maze. Then a figure entered from the left of the frame. Margaret. She wore a white nightgown, hair loose, looking much younger than by day, moving silently like a drifting ghost. She stood in the center of the living room for a moment, as if confirming something. Then she walked to the stairs, looked up, seemed satisfied no one was there, and returned to the center. Her lips were moving, as if talking to herself or to someone. I zoomed in, trying to read her lips. But the light was too dim. Soon she stopped speaking and began pacing, her fingers brushing the picture frames on the wall, my frames, my parents' photos, my mother's portrait. Her finger paused for an instant on my mother's face, then withdrew, as if burned. About 10 minutes later, a sound came from the stairs at the right side of the frame. William appeared, also in a nightgown, hair tousled. He stopped midway down the stairs, looking at his mother below, his body motionless, as if spellbound. Margaret looked up and beckoned to him. Her lips moved. I made out the words, "Come here." William walked down. His movements were strange, not like an adult approaching his mother, but like a sleepwalker answering a summons. He stopped 2 steps away. They stood face to face, silent for a long time. Then Margaret cupped his face in her hands. It was not a mother's gesture. It was a lover's. Her thumbs stroked his cheeks, his eyes half closed, lips slightly parted. They were speaking, too low to record, but their body language spoke a language I did not understand. No, it was a language I did not want to understand. The firelight dimmed, the frame went almost black. I could only see 2 human shadows leaning together. A sound came from the speakers, not words, but a low, rhythmic murmur, like a chant or a lullaby, repeating over and over, the same word. Mine, mine, mine. I slammed the laptop shut, veins bulging on the back of my hand. A surge rose in my stomach. I rushed to the sink in the corner of the studio and retched, bringing up nothing. I braced myself against the edge of the sink, gasping, my reflection in the mirror pale, lips blue-tinged, eyes red as if bleeding. I don't know how long passed. I straightened up, splashed cold water on my face, and sat back down at the computer. My hands were still shaking, but now it was no longer fear. It was something harder. Rage. The rage of being deceived for 12 years, of my father's money being used to buy this house and turn it into a grand, ornate sickbed. I opened the oldest video. The date was the 15th of June, 2014, about 10 years ago. I calculated, that was the summer after we'd been married just 2 years. Margaret had come to stay with us in our London flat for 2 weeks. I was 28 then, just promoted, working my feet off. I came home wanting only to fall into bed. I remembered William being exceptionally considerate that fortnight, saying every night, "You're too tired, Mum will take care of me." I was even grateful, thinking having my mother-in-law help with the chores was a blessing. The video was short, only 15 minutes. The camera was positioned differently, a high, angled view, presumably from Mrs. Henderson aiming the camera at the flat's living room. No, this wasn't the London flat. It was the living room of this house. 10 years ago, Margaret and William had already been here. What were they doing? The frame lit up in night vision grey-green. Time was past 3 a.m. There were people in the living room, 2 of them. Margaret sat on the sofa, William lay on her lap, his posture like a giant infant. Her hand ran through his hair, combing it slowly, her lips murmuring something. William's eyes were wide open, staring at a point in the void, his expression dazed, as if not in this time. This position lasted nearly 10 minutes. Then Margaret lowered her head, her lips pressing to his forehead. It wasn't a kiss on the forehead, it was a suckling. Her lips lingered for a long time, her body swaying slightly, as if nursing. William's body stiffened for an instant, then went completely limp. One hand lifted and clutched the lapel of her nightgown, like a nursing infant clutching his mother's clothing. This time I really vomited, emptying what little remained in my stomach. Acid burned my throat, tears followed, I couldn't tell if from the retching or something else. I clung to the sink, shivering, teeth chattering like a dying animal. The video was still playing, but I did not watch further. I closed the player, shut the laptop, and unplugged the drive, like pulling out a poisoned tooth. Outside, thunder and lightning, rain lashed the windows, the garden trees bent and groaned in the wind. I gripped the drive tightly, my nails scoring the metal casing. I had to calm down. I had to think clearly about what to do next. If it were only adultery, I could confront, divorce, take what was mine. But this was not adultery. This was nothing. It was a 30-year-old abnormal symbiosis starting when William was 7 or 8. Margaret had bound this man to her side by some method I did not understand, turning him into a puppet in a grown man's body. And I, unknowingly, had become an accomplice and a cover, a respectable wife, a pretty disguise, a fool providing funds to buy a nest of love. My father's legacy. My mother's brooch. Every penny I'd saved. All turned into their private den. Anger heated the cold blood in my veins again. I stood up, walked to the studio window, and looked out at the garden being battered by the rain. This was the garden I'd dreamed of: roses, lavender, the clematis my mother loved. Now those thoughts were like shards of glass lodged in my throat. There were other videos I hadn't watched. The remaining 4 files spanned from 10 years ago to this summer. I didn't know what else they contained, perhaps older recordings, perhaps even more unbearable images. But whatever they were, I had to watch them all. I needed to know the whole truth before I could decide how to fight back. I sat down again, opened the computer, and placed my fingers steadily on the touchpad. This time, I did not tremble. I opened the remaining 4 videos one by one and examined each. The second video was recorded on Christmas Eve 2017, the year we spent Christmas at Margaret's home in Bath. The camera was aimed at the living room of that bathhouse, again late at night, again William lying on the sofa with his head on Margaret's lap. In the picture, Margaret was crying, tears streaming, her lips moving. William's body was curled up, like an animal seeking shelter. At the end of the video, Margaret used the sleeve of her nightgown to wipe something off his face, tears or saliva, unclear, and then held him as they both disappeared down the hallway. The third video was from March 2021, during the lockdown. The location was back in this house, then occupied by the previous tenant, an elderly woman living alone. The Hendersons had sold the house to her, and she lived there less than 2 years before moving to a care home. In the video, Margaret and William appeared in the garden. They entered through the side door. They had a key. William was digging a hole with a spade under the yew tree in the corner of the garden, while Margaret stood by holding a box, not large, showbox-sized, wrapped in cloth. They buried the box, filled the hole, and placed a stone on top. The whole process took less than half an hour. They exchanged no words, moving in perfect coordination, as if they had done this many times. The fourth video was from June this year, 5 months before we bought the house. The scene was daytime, the living room filled with sunlight. Margaret sat alone on a chair in the middle of the living room, facing the fireplace, like a statue. She sat motionless for 2 full hours, her eyes fixed on a spot above the mantelpiece. I zoomed in and saw she was looking at a small photo frame, our engagement photo, hung there at some unknown time. At the end of the video, she finally stood up, walked to the frame, and extended a finger, slowly tracing a circle around my face in the picture, like drawing a target. The 5th video was from September this year, 2 months ago, during our negotiations to buy the house. This time William appeared alone. He stood in the empty living room, the previous owner's furniture had been removed, and talked to the air. No sound, only his moving lips. His expression alternated between pleading, anger, and tears. As he spoke, he dropped to his knees in the middle of the living room, wrapped his arms around himself, and began rocking back and forth, like a human metronome. This state lasted nearly an hour. Finally, he stood up, his expression calm again, as if nothing had happened. The 6th video was the one from 3 days ago. I finished watching all 6 videos by 3 a.m. The storm had stopped, the garden puddles reflected cold light. I locked the hard drive in the studio's iron cabinet, unplugged the laptop, and held it to my chest as I sat against the wall. Countless fragments began to assemble into a complete picture in my mind. Margaret had lived alone with William since he was 8. Mr. Henderson said she claimed to be a widow, her husband dead of disease on a ship. But I had never heard William mention his father, and Margaret was tight-lipped about it. At our wedding, the seats on the bride's side were nearly empty, just a few friends and distant relatives. The groom's side was also sparse. Margaret said their family was small, with few relatives. And I believed it. I believed everything. Why did an 8-year-old boy need his mother to bathe him? Why wouldn't Margaret let her son interact with the outside world? Why were the bedroom doors closed for hours at night? Those sounds Mr. Henderson heard, the sounds he dared not name, what were they? My husband, from age 8, had been Margaret's prisoner. No, that wasn't the question. The question was, is it still happening? Those videos proved that 30 years later, the relationship had not ended, it had continued in more secret, more twisted forms. It needed no chains, no locked doors. It was a domestication rooted in bone, a spiritual possession harder to break than any physical bond. And the way Margaret looked at me, that measuring, appraising gaze, she had known my purpose from the start. I was a mask, a shield, a tool to make her son appear normal to the outside world. She allowed William to marry me not out of love, but because she needed me as cover. I worked, saved, bought a house, wore myself out, while she only needed to lie there and wait for me to prepare everything, then move in and continue the 30-year-old secret ritual with her son. I was the financier of this house, yet the only outsider in this family. Before dawn, I made a decision. I would not confront them immediately. If I threw the video in their faces now, Margaret would deny it, William would collapse, and Margaret would use her methods to soothe and control him again. 30 years of domestication would not unravel in a single night of truth. They would unite against me, paint me as paranoid, delusional, hysterical. William would side with her, he always did. I needed more. I needed to know exactly how Margaret had controlled him, what was buried under that yew tree, what had happened to William's father. I needed evidence that could not be denied. I needed a plan that could sever this bond completely, not a confrontation doomed to fail. At dawn, a soft knock came at the studio door. "Eleanor." It was Margaret's voice, gentle, smooth, like iron wrapped in velvet. "Are you awake? I've made tea, would you like a cup?" I shoved the laptop behind the easel, stood up, smoothed my hair and clothes, and opened the door. Margaret stood outside with a tray bearing 2 cups of black tea and a plate of ginger biscuits. She wore a dark blue dressing gown, her silver hair loose on her shoulders, her face wearing a carefully measured smile of concern. Her eyes swept past me into the studio and paused on my face for a few seconds. "You haven't slept all night?" she asked. "Dark circles under your eyes. Insomnia again?" "I'll have William get you some sleeping pills, he always keeps some." "No need," I said. "Have some tea anyway, it's warming." She pushed the tray forward. I took 1 cup. It was scalding, the warmth of the porcelain seeped through my fingertips into my veins. I stared at the deep amber liquid and suddenly thought of something. Margaret always made tea for William. For all 12 years of our marriage, every time we visited her or she visited us, she brewed tea for him with her own hands. William never refused, always drank every drop. I had never wondered why. "Why aren't you drinking?" she asked, her voice soft. "It's not too hot." Slowly I raised the cup to my lips and pretended to sip. The liquid did not touch my lips. "It's good," I said. "Thank you, Margaret." Her smile deepened, a satisfied smile, like a cat watching its bowl of milk. She did not leave immediately, but stood at the door, leisurely surveying me, as if reassessing her prey. "Eleanor, don't you feel everything has become better since we moved into this house?" she said suddenly. "William is happy, I'm happy, and you should be too. Our family can finally live well together." "Family," I repeated. "Of course." She leaned slightly toward me. "I've always treated you as my own daughter. Even though you never gave William a child, I have never blamed you." That sentence was like a needle piercing my already numb heart. For years I had believed the inability to conceive was my fault. I had undergone countless tests, taken countless medicines, shed countless tears. Every time I broke down, Margaret would gently comfort me, saying, "It's all right, you have William." And I had thought that was tolerance. "I'll go wake William." She turned away. The hem of her dressing gown rustled across the hallway floor like a snake through grass. I closed the door and poured the tea down the sink. The liquid ran down the white ceramic, leaving a pale brown stain, like dried blood. I walked to the window and looked at the yew tree in the garden. It stood especially dark in the morning light, its needles a near black green, like a silent graveyard keeper. At its base lay an inconspicuous stone, half buried in the soil, surrounded by weeds. What lay beneath it? At 10 in the morning, I changed and went downstairs. Margaret was busy in the kitchen. William sat at the table, a half-eaten plate of eggs and toast before him, holding a cup of black tea, her brew. He took a sip, his expression serene, like a fed child. "Good morning, darling," he said, seeing me, smiling. "Mum made a full English breakfast. Yours is warming in the oven." "I'm not hungry," I said. Margaret turned from the stove, wearing my apron, spatula in hand. "You have to eat even if you're not hungry. Look how thin you are. William, you should take better care of your wife." "She's always like this," William shrugged, sipping his tea. I noticed his fingers holding the cup trembling slightly, like Mr. Henderson's. "What's the plan for today?" I asked. "Mum wants us to go to Canterbury Cathedral with her," William said. "She says we should give thanks for the new house." Margaret added, "I know the vicar there, an old friend of mine. We can stay a while at the cathedral and come back in the afternoon." William said, "You want to plant flowers? I know a good nursery we can stop by on the way back." She said all this in a natural, flowing tone, as if these things were self-evident. Accompany her to church, spend the entire afternoon with her, she was part of every plan, every decision. And I, the owner of the house, after 12 years of marriage, had unconsciously become a mere outsider providing funds. "I have a client today," I lied. "I've arranged to meet someone this morning about a project." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sunday? What client is so urgent?" "A gallery person. You know, the pre-Christmas exhibition." She stared at me for 2 seconds, then her smile returned. "What a pity. But never mind, William and I will go. Isn't that right, William?" William nodded, his eyes still on his teacup. I picked up my bag and walked out of the kitchen. At the door, I glanced back. Margaret stood at the stove, her back to me, shoulders slightly raised, her posture displaying something I had never seen before, not satisfaction, but something more primal, a possessive stance, like a mother animal guarding her young, muscles taut, ready to spring at any approaching threat. And William sat there, drinking cup after cup of her tea, his eyes half-lidded, like a frog being slowly boiled in warm water, unaware of the rising temperature. Or perhaps he had noticed, but had long since given up struggling. I stepped outside, inhaling the sharp, cold air. The garage door was open. I drove out, but not to any client. I drove 3 streets and stopped at the public library. The Canterbury Library was open on Sundays. The electronic reading room had public computers. I needed to look up some things. Look up old newspapers from 30 years ago. Look up what happened to William's father. Look up Margaret Astoria Crawford, her full name, and find out who she really was. The library was quiet, only a few elderly people reading newspapers. I turned on a computer and entered the digital archive of the Kent County local newspapers. I searched Margaret's maiden name, Green. Results were sparse, a few brief mentions of church charity events, noting Mrs. Green donated floral arrangements. Then I searched William Blackwood father and maritime death records Australia route. The database returned 2 matches. The first was a brief obituary in the Kent Messenger from 1988. Richard Blackwood, 32, died of illness aboard a cargo ship bound for Sydney, leaving his wife Margaret and 7-year-old son William. The notice was succinct, no photo, no funeral details, nothing. The second was from the same year, in the social news section, with the headline, "Local man mysteriously lost at sea, wife says illness, ship's log suggests otherwise." My heart leaped. I clicked on the article and enlarged it. The report was short. Richard Blackwood, a dockworker, had been hired on a cargo ship departing Dover for Sydney. While the ship was in the Indian Ocean, Richard disappeared. The captain's log recorded that he fell overboard during the night, but 2 crew members gave different statements to police. Richard had had a violent argument with his wife before departure. She had tried to bring their son aboard at the last moment, and when the captain refused, Richard became distraught. The crew member's testimony mentioned that Richard had multiple bruises on his body when he boarded, which he attributed to a domestic dispute. Ultimately, insufficient evidence led to the case being closed as accidental death. The last line of the article read, "Mrs. Margaret Blackwood declined to comment to this newspaper and moved away from her previous residence with her 7-year-old son. Her current whereabouts are unknown." I stared at the screen, my fingers cold. Richard Blackwood, 32 years old, had died in the Indian Ocean. His wife inherited his insurance money, took her son, and moved to Canterbury, renting from the Hendersons. And that 7-year-old boy had never left his mother's side since. I printed the 2 articles, folded them, and tucked them into my bag. Then I sat back down at the computer and opened the land registry's search page. I needed to check the transaction history of this house. Mr. Henderson said he bought it 40 years ago, but Margaret had buried something in the garden 10 years ago. How did she get in? Why did she have keys? My eyes ran down the land registry records. In 1982, Thomas Henderson and Margaret Henderson purchased the house. In 2016, the Hendersons sold the property to an elderly woman named Fiona Gray. In August 2023, Ms. Gray moved into a care home due to illness and entrusted an agent to list the house for sale, the ad we had seen. But the problem was the March 2021 video. When Margaret and William buried something in the garden, the house belonged to Fiona Gray. Why would a solitary 80-year-old woman allow a strange mother and son into her garden? Only one possibility: Fiona Gray was not a stranger. I reopened the search engine and typed Fiona Gray Canterbury. The first result was an obituary from last autumn in the Kent Messenger. Fiona Maud Gray, 83, passed away peacefully at St. Augustine's Care Home, Canterbury. The obituary included a photo of a kind-faced white-haired lady wearing pearl earrings. It listed her survivors: daughter Margaret, son-in-law Richard, deceased, grandson William, and granddaughter-in-law Eleanor. My name appeared in the obituary of a woman I had never met. Fiona Gray was Margaret's mother, William's grandmother. And this house, the one William and I had just bought, had been sold by the Hendersons to Fiona Gray in 2016, and then listed after Fiona moved to a care home. Margaret had had free access to this house for 7 full years because she had her mother's keys. So did William. They had come and gone as they pleased, treating this place as their own territory, long before my marriage to William began, long before I even knew this house existed. And when I suggested we buy it, how did William and Margaret react? I remembered the day I excitedly brought home the estate agent's flyer, saying I'd found a perfect Tudor house online, with a garden, on the outskirts of Canterbury, within our budget. William's reaction had been odd, not surprise, but a long pause, followed by what a coincidence. Margaret came to our place the next day, saying she happened to know the area and could help us evaluate the property. She had been involved in every viewing, every negotiation, every signature. At the closing, she was more enthusiastic than I was, personally choosing the curtain fabric for the master bedroom. They had known about this house all along. They were not accompanying me to buy it, they were letting me buy it for them. I sat in the library chair for a long time, until the light outside began to fade. The printouts in my bag felt hot, like burning evidence. I needed to go back, but I couldn't yet. There was one more thing I had to do: go to the hospital. No, not for me. For William. I suspected she had been putting something in his tea. That placid, sluggish, compliant state seemed beyond pure psychological control. If she had used drugs on him, I needed to know what, and whether it could be withdrawn. I drove to a private clinic in Canterbury and booked an appointment with a toxicology consultant under a false name. I said I suspected a friend was being chronically drugged through food, and asked what samples I needed to bring for testing. The doctor gave me a sampling kit and told me I needed blood, urine, and hair samples. Hair was best for detecting long-term drug use. I hid the kit in my bag and left. When I got home, it was dark. The living room was empty, the kitchen held their dinner plates and leftovers. I tiptoed upstairs. The master bedroom door was ajar, and from inside came Margaret's low voice. She was reading something aloud, her tone monotonous and rhythmic, as if performing a ritual. I glanced in as I passed. William lay on the bed, eyes closed, his head resting on Margaret's lap. Margaret held a book in one hand, reading, while the other hand ran through his hair, stroking it slowly, exactly as in the video. She did not look up, but she must have known I was standing at the door. Her voice did not pause, yet the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. I went into the guest room, closed the door, and locked it. Then I took the sampling kit from my bag and sat on the bed in the darkness, waiting. Waiting for 3 a.m., waiting for everyone in this house to sink into the deepest sleep. Then I would obtain what I needed: William's hair, Margaret's hair, and the remnants of the tea William had drunk. Evidence. I would gather every piece of evidence. I would uproot this 30-year tumor, no matter how deep it had grown. Outside, rain began again, tapping against the leaded glass like many small fingers. Knocking. In the distance, church bells struck 11. 4 hours more. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. In my mind echoed Mr. Henderson's words, "My wife always remembered that boy. She was kinder than me." That boy was still trapped in this house. He had just grown up, and no one thought he needed saving anymore. Except me. I suddenly opened my eyes and sat upright in the dark. I remembered something. The obituary I'd found at the library: Fiona Gray, 83, passed away peacefully. She was Margaret's mother, William's grandmother. But what had Margaret told me? She said she was an only child, her parents died young, she grew up in a church orphanage. William also said, "My mother had a hard life, no parents." She had lied to me for 12 years. Even her background was false. But why would a woman who had been lying for decades leave such an obvious trail in the purchase of her mother's house? I sat in the dark, a sense of foreboding slowly creeping up my spine. An instinct told me there was an even bigger secret. The reason Margaret so urgently pushed me to buy this house was not because I needed a home, but because this house held something she could not lose. The box under that yew tree. What was inside it? At 3 a.m., the rain stopped. The whole house was wrapped in an unnatural silence, not even a whisper of wind, as if the world held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I gently opened the guest room door. The hallway was pitch black, save for a dim night light at the stair landing. The master bedroom door was closed, no sound within. Barefoot, I moved along the wall, each floorboard testing my nerves. This old house was like a sleeping elder, every joint liable to creak at the worst moment. I went first to the master bedroom. The door was not locked. I pushed it open a crack, holding my breath. Dim light from the curtains let me make out the scene. On that mahogany four-poster bed, William lay curled on the left side, like a fetus in the womb. Margaret lay flat on the right, her nightgown perfectly neat, hands folded over her chest. She slept in a posture so correct it seemed rigid. I watched her for 10 seconds, confirming her breathing was steady and deep. Then I looked at the bedside table. A half-drunk glass of water. Beside it, William's comb, with a few chestnut hairs caught in it. I crept over, each step like diffusing a bomb. The floorboards groaned faintly under my feet. At each sound I paused, checking that the breathing on the bed had not changed. By the time I reached the bedside table, my palms were slick with sweat. First I took the comb and used tweezers to pull the hairs into a sample bag. 5 strands, enough. Then I took a small glass vial from my pocket and poured in the remaining water from the cup. Tea leaves were settled at the bottom. I scraped them with a cotton swab and put them into another sample bag. Margaret's comb was on the vanity. I similarly took a few strands of her silver hair. Just as I was about to withdraw from the room, the mattress spring let out a sound. I froze. Margaret's body stirred. Her hand slipped from her chest to her side, her head turned toward me. In the darkness, her eyes were closed, but I could feel her breath change, no longer even, but shallow and quick, as if some alert instinct remained active even in sleep. I stood less than 2 meters from the bed, holding my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I wondered if she could hear it. After a long 10 seconds, her breathing steadied again. Her hand did not move. I slipped out of the room and gently pulled the door back to its original position. In the hallway, I realized I had been holding my breath so long my chest ached. Next, the study. I needed to copy whatever useful material I could from William's computer, his communications with Margaret, his spending records over the years, anything that could prove the abnormal relationship between mother and son. He was still asleep, but I knew the sofa bed was right above his head, any noise might wake him. I stood in the hallway for a long time, weighing risk against reward, then turned and went downstairs. The computer could wait. Compared to the risk, I had another more urgent target. The garden. I put on a dark raincoat and slipped out through the kitchen door. The garden in the early hours was soaked in the damp cold after rain. The soil was soft, making faint, squelching sounds underfoot. The air smelled of wet leaves and earth, tinged with the faint bitter fragrance of yew. The yew tree stood at the far end of the garden, about 3 paces from the wall. In the night it looked especially massive, its branches gnarled, foliage dense, like a crouching black beast. The stone at its base was still in place, half buried, covered with moss. I took a small spade from the tool shed, knelt on the wet grass, and began to dig. The soil was soaked through and soft, not difficult to dig. But kneeling on the ground, my knees quickly went numb with cold. I dug fast, each spadeful carrying the fear and rage accumulated over the past 24 hours. When the spade struck something hard, I stopped and brushed aside the earth with my fingers. An iron box. Not a showbox, but an old-fashioned biscuit tin, rusted on the surface but intact. I lifted the box out and set it on the grass. It was not heavy, something inside rattled slightly. I pried open the rusted latch and lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of documents, wrapped in plastic bags to keep out moisture. On top was an envelope addressed to Mrs. Margaret Blackwood from a London law firm. Beneath the envelope was a passport, Richard Blackwood's, age 32, dockworker. The man in the photo had deep-set eyes, his features strongly resembling William's, but coarser and more weary. Besides the passport and documents, there was a videotape, old VHS format. The label bore neat handwriting, Richard, the 15th of March, 1988. The last images of her husband before his disappearance. I took out the documents one by one and quickly scanned them by the light of my phone. Most were legal papers, the insurance company's confirmation of payout for Richard's accidental death, beneficiary Margaret Blackwood, amount £35,000. Then a handwritten list, Margaret's script, detailing how she used the money, moving deposit, William's school fees, living reserve, nothing for herself. But the last document stopped my breath. It was an unsigned divorce petition. Dated February 1988, 1 month before Richard's death. The petitioner was Richard Blackwood. In the grounds for divorce, a typed line had been crossed out and retyped repeatedly. The final entry read, "The petitioner believes that the wife has an improper intimate relationship with the son, which has seriously affected the son's physical and mental health. The petitioner applies for sole custody." She had not signed it. 1 month later, he died in the Indian Ocean. I folded that document into a small square and tucked it into the waterproof pocket against my body. Then I took out the videotape and examined it with my torch. The tape was intact, no signs of mold. But I had no VCR. Who had VCRs these days? Still, Mr. Henderson might. He said his wife kept many old things. I replaced the box, covered it with soil, and pressed the stone back into place. Then I carried the videotape and crept back inside. It was past 4 a.m. when I returned to the guest room. I locked the sample bags and the tape in my suitcase, then sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness. The sentence from the divorce petition echoed in my mind. The petitioner believes that the wife has an improper intimate relationship with the son. 33 years ago, Richard Blackwood had already discovered it. He had tried to take his son away, to free William from that woman's control. He had failed. He had died at sea, and she had taken the insurance money, moved, and locked her son by her side for 33 years. And I, in complete ignorance, had become the newest link in that chain. I lay on the bed, closed my eyes, and the image replayed, William curled on the sofa, his head on his mother's lap, his expression dazed, his body bonelessly relaxed. That posture was not an adult's choice, it was regression. A soul whose growth had been stunted, retreating to age 8, and never truly emerging. What exactly had Margaret done to him? Was it pure psychological manipulation, or chemical means, or something more fundamental, more destructive? A 7-year-old boy, his father violently dead, raised by his mother in deliberate isolation and conditioning, what would he become? Had he ever tried to resist? Perhaps. Perhaps marrying me was his subconscious last attempt to escape. But he couldn't. Margaret would not let him. She followed him into our marital home, into our new house, like a wedge driven into every crack of his life, preventing him from ever closing. And I had been a tool from the start, a provider of normalcy, of money, of cover. At 6:30 in the morning, I was woken by sounds from the kitchen downstairs. Margaret was up again, making breakfast. I heard her talking with William, not making out words, but her tone was as gentle and assured as ever. I got up, went to the bathroom, and looked at myself in the mirror. Overnight, the fine lines at the corners of my eyes seemed to have multiplied. But my gaze was no longer as bewildered as last night, it held something else, a cold, hard resolve. I washed, dressed, and went downstairs. At the table, William was drinking his morning tea. Margaret stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders. When they saw me, both wore that rehearsed smile I knew too well. "Good morning, darling. Did you sleep well?" William asked. "Quite well," I said. "Are you going out today?" Margaret asked. "Yes, a client to see." The corner of her mouth lifted again, that slight curve seeming to say, "Another lie." I met her gaze without flinching. This was our first real confrontation, no evasion, no retreat. She sensed something, her eyes narrowing slightly, her fingers on William's shoulder curling, as if asserting dominion. "Drive carefully," she said, her voice now carrying an edge of wariness I had never heard before. I smiled and nodded, then turned and left. As I passed the kitchen door, I looked back at William one last time. He was drinking his tea, his gaze vacant and satisfied, like a filled vessel. In my heart I said to him, "I will pull you out. Whether you want to come out or not. Whether you remember what the outside world looks like. Because this house was bought with my father's money, this marriage bed was bought with my mother's heirloom, and your mother has no right to keep doing what she has done for 30 years inside the home I built." I drove out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, the Tudor house still looked beautiful in the morning light. The withered clematis vines twisted around the walls, the yew tree stood silent at the garden's end. The surface of this home was so perfect it broke my heart. And I was driving toward the deeper truth, toward the darkness beneath that surface. Mr. Henderson agreed to help me watch the videotape. He said he still had his late wife's old VCR in the basement, God willing it still works. I hung up and sped toward his house. There were still a few layers of veil over the truth, and I was patiently, determinedly peeling them away. Mr. Henderson was already waiting at the door. He wore the same frayed cardigan as if he had not changed since my last visit. His eyes were more bloodshot than yesterday, as if he had not slept all night. When he saw me, he did not exchange pleasantries, only silently stepped aside to let me in. The living room curtains were drawn tight, the fire in the grate had gone out, leaving a pile of grey ash. On the coffee table sat an old VCR, already connected to the TV, the yellow video cable curling like withered vines. On top of the VCR lay the tape I had brought, its label stark in the dim light, Richard, the 15th of March, 1988. "The machine still works," Mr. Henderson said, his voice hoarse. "I tested it with an old tape, the picture wobbles, but it plays. But I need to tell you something first. Last night after you left, I went through my wife's things again. She left a letter for me. It mentions this tape." He pulled an envelope from his pocket, yellowed paper, edges worn. It was addressed to Thomas. "When did she write it?" I asked. 10 years ago. When we sold that house." He extracted the letter but did not hand it to me. "She said she didn't install the camera in that house to watch wild cats or hedgehogs. She said she never forgot that boy, your William. After he and his mother moved away 30 years ago, my wife kept track of them in secret. She learned that Margaret had moved back to Canterbury, that her mother Fiona had bought our old house. My wife felt something was wrong, that this woman had come back to that house for a reason. So she pretended to visit an old neighbor and hid the camera behind the living room curtain rod." He handed me the letter. The handwriting was delicate, but grew increasingly erratic, as if the writer's mood had deteriorated. I read it line by line, and when I reached the final paragraph, my fingers stopped moving. "Thomas, there are things I never told you. That videotape was sent to me by Richard Blackwood before he disappeared. In his letter, He said that if anything happened to him, I should give the tape to his son when he came of age. I never gave it to him, because I didn't know if I should. The boy was too tightly controlled by his mother. I didn't know if giving it to him would only hurt him more. But now we're moving, and the boy is grown and married. Maybe he needs to know the truth. I'm leaving the tape and the camera's memory card with you. It's your decision. Richard Blackwood, before his disappearance, had sent a videotape to Mrs. Henderson. That tape, the one now on the coffee table, what was on it? Why had he sent it to a former landlord, not directly to the police? Have you watched this tape? I asked Mr. Henderson. He shook his head. My wife never showed it to me while she was alive. She said its contents were too heavy, once seen, never forgotten. She kept it locked in a steel cabinet in the basement, the key hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry box. It wasn't until last night, after I read her letter, that I went down and opened the cabinet and found the tape. I washed, dressed, and went downstairs. At the table, William was drinking his morning tea. Margaret stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders. When they saw me, both wore that rehearsed smile I knew too well. "Good morning, darling. Did you sleep well?" William asked. "Quite well," I said. "Are you going out today?" Margaret asked. "Yes, a client to see." The corner of her mouth lifted again, that slight curve seeming to say, "Another lie." I met her gaze without flinching. This was our first real confrontation, no evasion, no retreat. She sensed something, her eyes narrowing slightly, her fingers on William's shoulder curling, as if asserting dominion. "Drive carefully," she said, her voice now carrying an edge of wariness I had never heard before. I smiled and nodded, then turned and left. As I passed the kitchen door, I looked back at William one last time. He was drinking his tea, his gaze vacant and satisfied, like a filled vessel. In my heart I said to him, "I will pull you out. Whether you want to come out or not. Whether you remember what the outside world looks like. Because this house was bought with my father's money, this marriage bed was bought with my mother's heirloom, and your mother has no right to keep doing what she has done for 30 years inside the home I built." I drove out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, the Tudor house still looked beautiful in the morning light. The withered clematis vines twisted around the walls, the yew tree stood silent at the garden's end. The surface of this home was so perfect it broke my heart. And I was driving toward the deeper truth, toward the darkness beneath that surface. Mr. Henderson agreed to help me watch the videotape. He said he still had his late wife's old VCR in the basement, God willing it still works. I hung up and sped toward his house. There were still a few layers of veil over the truth, and I was patiently, determinedly peeling them away. Mr. Henderson was already waiting at the door. He wore the same frayed cardigan as if he had not changed since my last visit. His eyes were more bloodshot than yesterday, as if he had not slept all night. When he saw me, he did not exchange pleasantries, only silently stepped aside to let me in. The living room curtains were drawn tight, the fire in the grate had gone out, leaving a pile of grey ash. On the coffee table sat an old VCR, already connected to the TV, the yellow video cable curling like withered vines. On top of the VCR lay the tape I had brought, its label stark in the dim light, Richard, the 15th of March, 1988. "The machine still works," Mr. Henderson said, his voice hoarse. "I tested it with an old tape, the picture wobbles, but it plays. But I need to tell you something first. Last night after you left, I went through my wife's things again. She left a letter for me. It mentions this tape." He pulled an envelope from his pocket, yellowed paper, edges worn. It was addressed to Thomas. "When did she write it?" I asked. 10 years ago. When we sold that house." He extracted the letter but did not hand it to me. "She said she didn't install the camera in that house to watch wild cats or hedgehogs. She said she never forgot that boy, your William. After he and his mother moved away 30 years ago, my wife kept track of them in secret. She learned that Margaret had moved back to Canterbury, that her mother Fiona had bought our old house. My wife felt something was wrong, that this woman had come back to that house for a reason. So she pretended to visit an old neighbor and hid the camera behind the living room curtain rod." He handed me the letter. The handwriting was delicate, but grew increasingly erratic, as if the writer's mood had deteriorated. I read it line by line, and when I reached the final paragraph, my fingers stopped moving. Thomas, there are things I never told you. That videotape was sent to me by Richard Blackwood before he disappeared. In his letter, he said that if anything happened to him, I should give the tape to his son when he came of age. I never gave it to him, because I didn't know if I should. The boy was too tightly controlled by his mother. I didn't know if giving it to him would only hurt him more. But now we're moving, and the boy is grown and married. Maybe he needs to know the truth. I'm leaving the tape and the camera's memory card with you. It's your decision. Richard Blackwood, before his disappearance, had sent a videotape to Mrs. Henderson. That tape, the one now on the coffee table, what was on it? Why had he sent it to a former landlord, not directly to the police? Have you watched this tape? I asked Mr. Henderson. He shook his head. My wife never showed it to me while she was alive. She said its contents were too heavy, once seen, never forgotten. She kept it locked in a steel cabinet in the basement, the key hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry box. It wasn't until last night, after I read her letter, that I went down and opened the cabinet and found the tape.